We've been hoping, suggesting, letting you know that the DEA this summer was going to decide whether marijuana would be kept as a Schedule 1 drug or rescheduled. And this is really important because Schedule 1 drugs, by their very classification, are much more difficult to research for medical uses. They're generally criminalized in a much more aggressive way. And the definition of Schedule 1 drugs is that there is no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The DEA thought about it, as we said they were, and they decided to keep marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug based on, quote, scientific and medical evaluation that they did in partnership with the Food and Drug Administration. Here's a quote from the DEA about this decision, saying, "The DEA and the FDA continue to believe that scientifically valid and well-controlled clinical trials conducted under investigational new drug applications are the most appropriate way to conduct research on the medicinal uses of marijuana." Yeah, it's the most appropriate way, Lewis, if you're trying to keep that research very limited, very difficult, very expensive, and progressing incredibly slowly.
Yes, this really has nothing to do with the research. Maybe a little bit to do with the research because as it relates to funding. But to me, this is all about just maintaining the structure and size of the DEA because let's face it, most of what they do revolves around pot, does it not?
There's a lot of self-interest because marijuana enforcement brings in a ton of money, not just for the DEA, but for a ton of agencies and local police agencies in many cases as well. Let me show you the list of Schedule 1 drugs that are on that same list as marijuana. And again, Schedule 1 drugs defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. So the list includes heroin, LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, peyote, and quaaludes. This reminds me of that little kid game, Lewis. Which one is not like the others? And you might be interested to know that the painkiller Vicodin, as well as meth and oxycodone, are Schedule 2 drugs. This is not a scheduling of marijuana that makes much sense, is it?
On a side note, we also know that ecstasy actually does have medical uses.
Yeah, right. Good point.
Apart from that, this is all about, this is just the higher ups at the DEA and other federal agencies being greedy.
Yeah.
It's about money. It's about keeping people's jobs. It's about maintaining the status quo, which is good to them, with no concern for the citizens of this country.
And it's also demonstrably false that there's no medical use, right? We know of cannabis oil extract being very helpful in controlling the symptoms of epilepsy and seizures. We know that it's been useful in treating nausea as a side effect for a variety of medications, including chemotherapy. And there's this sort of catch-22 where in order to do more research, scientists need to do more studies. In order to do that, the studies have to be approved by federal agencies, including the DEA and the FDA and occasionally the National Institute on Drug Abuse. But it's much more difficult to get those approvals while it is Schedule 1. Where are you on this issue, Jason? I know it seemed earlier like you have very strong feelings about this research issue.
Well, I actually did some interviews of some researchers at UCSF at one point, and they were actually not about marijuana but about LSD, and they're actually using it for Alzheimer's patients, and it helped them kind of cope with their end of death syndrome, as well as I know there's uses for certain native tribes where they use peyote to kind of to solve kind of the same thing, major anxiety issues, and there are definite uses for not only marijuana but LSD, peyote to solve major issues with the brain.
There's no logically consistent case to me, and I think Jason is getting at this correctly, for legal cigarettes, legal alcohol, and not marijuana, period. Whatever your personal feelings are about smoking weed, right? And as you know, Lewis, I believe that the actual smoking process of anything is demonstrably bad for your lungs. That's a separate issue. Like my personal views about smoking stuff are completely different from the empirical sort of bankruptcy of saying, oh, cigarettes should be legal and alcohol should be legal, but it should be difficult to even study medicinal uses of marijuana.
Well, and you don't need to smoke it, but let's add another huge one. Opiates are legal too. And these harmful, incredibly addictive painkillers, that's what we give to people who are suffering from pain. when they could be using marijuana products, which is far safer and far less addictive, arguably not addictive at all. Instead, we're loading them up on Percocets and Vicodins and Oxys.
And not to mention, when you look at the Schedule 2 nature of a lot of those opiate painkillers that Lewis mentions, in the Northeast, where there's a real problem with the heroin epidemic, if you look at how many heroin addicts started with a legitimate prescription for opiate painkillers because of an injury they had or for whatever reason, it's huge. So those Schedule 2 drugs that are apparently not as concerning as marijuana based on the scheduling are in many cases actually a gateway to heroin use. And we still have really no strong evidence that opening up cannabis for medical research will actually serve as a gateway to other drug use. The entire system is bankrupt, Lewis. This decision by the FDA, we had sort of our hopes up that there would be a rescheduling, but ultimately the status quo prevailed.
Yeah, like it tends to do. The DEA just completely morally bankrupt at this point.
Hey, make sure to check out our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/Reddit. That's REDDIT. You can suggest stories there and so much more.